Good morning, everyone. You're listening live to your host, Toni Lontis, all the way from the Gold Coast, Australia, where our show travels from here to Florida in the US, and then soon we'll be going off up to Canada to talk to our amazing Canadian guest today, Greg Frankson. Hello to my beautiful radio technician, Rebel. I'm so happy you're here today. So, listeners, I love to hear from you. And you can do that by popping your question or comment into the chat box at the bottom right-hand side of your screen if you're listening live on the w4wn.com site. Otherwise, you can jump onto my website, ToniLontis.com, and have a look around. You can subscribe to my blog and my newsletter, see my latest social media feeds, but most of all, I'd love you to pop onto the Radio Toni Facebook page and let me know you're there. Say hi, send me a message. So I'd like to know how you're all doing out there in the world today. I'd like to know that life's okay, that you're okay, and that somehow you're all good. Again, if you'd like to pop into the chat box today and let me know you're listening, tell me where you're listening from. I've got a prize for the first 5 listeners who pop their email address into the chat box today. So, what's caught my eye this week across the internet? Did you know the top trending hashtags this week have included lover music video? I'll get that right. Hashtag lover music video. And in Australia, one of the top trending hashtags was hashtag Sydney trains. And I can only guess that that's because the service is not quite what it should be. Rounding off the top 5 hashtags across the world is the hashtag Amazon fires. As I guess most of you know, there's raging fires across the Amazon this week. One of the most interesting stats I found this week when I was researching iHeartRadio was that there are an incredible 128 million users of iHeartRadio, with 250 active listeners listening to iHeartRadio stations each month. And that the consumer awareness of iHeartRadio is at 84%. Some incredible statistics there. And I'm wondering if you know that my podcast of Radio Toni is available on iHeartRadio, and I'll pop the links for that into the chat box later. So over to what's making news across the world. And firstly, into Canada. The editor of a virulently bigoted and misogynistic Canadian publication has just been sentenced to a year in prison for promoting hate. In January, James Sears, 55, and his publisher, Leroy Street Germain, 77, were found guilty of hate crimes connected to the quarterly publication of Your Ward News, a small newspaper published in Ontario and online. The Canadian Press reports that Sears attempted to have a new trial reopened over claims his lawyer had intentionally lost, but the judge denied the bid and instead sentenced him. It's actually good news to hear that some of the judges across the world are actually seeking to put people in jail for promoting hate. So James, apparently the editor of this Canadian publication was promoting hate against women and Jewish people. And so the judges have sentenced him to a year in prison. Pretty good news, I think. Also out of Canada this morning is the fact that the autism diagnosis has been so broad that it prevents a better understanding of how the autistic brain works. And this is from Canadian researchers. In a meta-analysis published by JAMA Psychiatry, researchers in Quebec and Denmark analysed 11 previous major reviews on people with autism and the rest of the population. and they discovered that the whole diagnosis could nearly be meaningless because of what they're discovering about the autism diagnosis. So Ivy wants to know, they were printing hate and promoting it. Yes, Ivy, I understand that the newspaper was printing really hateful stuff. And getting away for it, obviously, for a certain amount of time until they were finally caught and brought to judgment. Also over in Canada, the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, sat down with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to discuss what's happening in Hong Kong. They're urging both leaders to speak with one voice in response to China's actions regarding the democratic protests movement in Hong Kong. And you know, I would have been talking to you each week about the huge protests happening in Hong Kong, demonstrating some laws that are to come into place, which would mean that resident Hong Kong people could be sent to mainland China for crimes committed in Hong Kong, and that's what they're protesting about. Global protests are on the top of the mind for virtually every country in the world, the president of the Canadian International Council think tank said. And with a real risk of major bloodshed right now, we don't know what's going to happen. So at least one of the potential scenarios is that the Chinese army will be called in to suppress these protests. The visit by the US Pompeo was the first to Canada since taking on his current role. He will meet with Trudeau and his Canadian counterpart, Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland. Over to Germany, where an 8-year-old boy has been found safe after taking his parents' car for an 87-mile-per-hour nighttime spin down the motorway in Germany. He tearfully told police he just wanted to drive a little bit. The child, who had used go-karts and bumper cars before, took his parents' Volkswagen Golf Automatic from his home in Soest and headed towards Dortmund at a high speed before reportedly feeling unwell 8 kilometres down the road and pulling into a lay-by. The alarm was raised by his mother at 12:25 a.m. on Wednesday before she found him about an hour later. The boy had switched on his hazard lights and put a warning triangle behind the vehicle. Police said the little boy's adventure down the A44 had not caused any damage to people or property. But a very funny little story, and I'm sure that 8-year-old will not jump in mum and dad's car again. Over to the US, where police in Long Beach, California have appeared to have brought a mass shooting by arresting a hotel cook who had amassed an astonishing cache of powerful firearms and had well-laid plans to carry out a gun rampage throughout the hotel. The 37-year-old was picked up at his home in Huntington Beach on Tuesday. The previous day, he had allegedly confessed to a fellow worker at the Long Beach Marriott that he had planned to carry out the attack as a revenge act for a grudge he bore against the company. The fellow worker immediately sounded the alarm. In ensuing searches, police discovered a pile of firearms that included 2 pistols, 2 assault rifles of the sort used in several recent mass shootings, a pump-action shotgun, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Good pickup by the police and courageous act by the fellow worker who sounded the alarm and prevented the deaths of many people. Over to Indonesia, where Indonesia has deployed more than 1,000 security personnel to West Papua and has cut internet access amid days of violent demonstrations in what activists say were the largest protests to occur in the region over the years. As you'll know, West Papua is very close to the tip of Australia, so anything that happens over there is of concern to Australians. Protests continued on Thursday night, including in the capital of Jakarta, where demonstrations flew the banned Morning Star flag in front of the State Palace. Scores have been arrested for raising the symbolic flag of independence in the past, with one activist spending more than 10 years in prison for the offence before he was released in 2015. On Wednesday, violent unrest occurred where a market was set ablaze and street battles erupted between police and protesters. Waving the morning flag, protesters chanted, "We are not red and white," in reference to the colours of the Indonesian flag. Police fired tear gas after the crowd set fire to the market and destroyed ATMs and shops. Local media reported in their local news. The crowd dispersed when white police fired warning shots. Indonesian media reported police arrested 45 people, including some they had accused of masterminding the protests and damaging the buildings. So over to Hong Kong and those continuing rallies across Hong Kong, and a peaceful rally at a metro station in Hong Kong descended into a clash between protesters and police as the city entered its 11th week of anti-government demonstrations. Hundreds of people took part in the sit-down at the out-of-town metro station earlier on Wednesday in a protest at a violent and indiscriminate attack on commuters and protesters there a month ago. And finally, in Australia, radio shock jock and rogue broadcaster Alan Jones is in trouble again. Last week, Jones, a very controversial radio host in Australia with a long history of making slurs against women in leadership roles, called New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern a clown and said that Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison should shove a sock down her throat after she spoke at regional leaders' meeting about combating climate change. In the wake of those comments, Alan Jones' show has lost advertisers at an alarming rate. And he said advertisers who chose to abandon his program because of his slurs against women will be replaced by others. He also said he had no comment about the advertisers. They can make their own judgment, he said, a defiant Jones told 9 News. There will be others that take their place. Jones' comment that New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern should be backhanded were condemned across Australia and New Zealand as dangerously misogynistic by women's groups, and advertisers will continue pulling their advertising from his morning show. So before we get on to the break, I just want to tell you a little bit about our wonderful Canadian guest. Before I do, Harper wants to know, is there no freedom of speech here? There is freedom of speech in Australia, but our freedom of speech also protects those that the speech is aimed to. So the advertisers are sending a powerful message to Alan Jones, the broadcaster, that he can't say horrible, nasty, misogynistic things because he thinks he has power. It's not right, and I'm glad his advertisers are pulling out of his show. So this week, I'm really excited to introduce our Canadian guest, and you, my listeners, will know that I'm an unabashed fan of Canada and all Canadians. My younger brother emigrated to Canada and married a Canadian lass and had 4 Canadian Aussie kids in the process some 27 years ago. There's a mutual love between the people of Canada and Australia. And a little bit about my Canadian guest. Greg before we throw to a break. So Greg Frankson was raised in Scarborough, Ontario by his single mother who taught him the value of education, hard work and perseverance. She knew that if he was ever going to make anything of himself, he would have to work twice as hard and have half the privileges of others. She also taught him to be strong so that he could push through barriers and obstacles in the world where black men are not expected to succeed. He never forgot those lessons. They shaped his path and influenced who he became. He's a first-generation Canadian of Jamaican descent, and Greg has experienced negative impacts of prejudice, discrimination and racism, and has learned how to endure and thrive. He's also enjoyed the moments when those who sought to deny him based on aspects of his personal story were disappointed by his successes. So we're going to go to a little break, and when we return, I'll have a wonderful conversation with Greg. Over to you, Rebel. And welcome back, everyone. You're listening to Radio Toni with your host, Toni Lontis. And today I have an amazing guest for you. His name is Greg Frankson, and he joins us from Canada this evening. Hello, Greg. How are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm good. It's still quite chilly here in Australia. We're in the end of winter, so I'm guessing that it's quite nice weather in Canada. You're in summer?
Yes, just the tail end of summer. The days are just starting to get shorter, but it's still nice and toasty up here in Toronto.
Excellent. So, Greg, thank you for coming on Radio Toni, and I thought that we'd start our session today by talking about your upbringing and where life began for you.
Well, I was raised in a government housing project in Scarborough, and Scarborough is the east end of what is now the city of Toronto. So, So I'm a Toronto kid, born and raised right through. Yes. I'm very, very proud to be from Scarborough, and coming up in that situation, we didn't have a lot. We had enough, and in life, I've always been taught from the very beginning that nothing is going to be handed to me, and so if I wanted to make anything of life, I was going to have to go out and earn it. So that's what I've been doing for all 44 years of my life, is just finding ways to move through life and to achieve what I wanted to achieve and to leverage what I have learned and what I have inherited and what I have been gifted with in order to do something positive in the world. Yeah.
So I understand that, like, your family background is from Jamaica, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
So was it your mum or dad from Jamaica and then the Canadian connection? How did that work for you?
Well, both of my parents are Jamaican.
Both Jamaican.
They were both born there, but they met in Toronto. So, so my father had emigrated straight from Jamaica to Canada. Yes. My mom and her family went to England first and lived there for 5 years before coming to Toronto.
Oh, wow.
And so they all got together here, and my mom had her own little group of friends, and I guess my dad, I don't know all the details. I wasn't around, but my understanding is that, they were all sort of part of the same social group, and then I showed up a little while later.
Yeah. So do you get back to Jamaica? Do you have family that you stay in contact with Jamaica, or is your life predominantly in Toronto, Canada?
Well, I'm based out of here, and my life is definitely here. But like most Jamaican families, I have relatives who are still in Jamaica. I have some in the United States. I have some in the United Kingdom. Yeah. So our family, family has sort of spread throughout what is traditionally part.
Global family, in the true sense of the word.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. So I'm interested how you got into poetry? Because, listeners, Greg is an amazing poet. And so I'd like to know where the roots of that poetry sprung from and how early in life you discovered poetry.
Well, before the poetry, I discovered words, and I was in love with words, from a very early age. My mom taught me how to read when I was 3 years old before I started to attend school. And so I've pretty much been in love with words ever since then. And, when I was a voracious reader as a child, you put anything in front of me and I would read it. And then over time, as I developed ability to write, then I started to write, all kinds of things, but, predominantly poetry at a very young age. I can't even remember how young I was when I first started writing poetry. It's just been part of my life for as long as I can remember.
That's amazing. Have you still got some of those early poems that you wrote as a child, Greg?
My mother tells me that she's got some boxes from my childhood shoved in the back of her garage. So at some point, I'll have to go digging through them and see if there's any old poetry from childhood in there. But on hand, I think the oldest stuff I have is from university on hand. Yeah. It
would be fascinating for you, wouldn't it, to dig into those boxes and find what you wrote as a child?
Yeah, fascinating and comical, I'm sure.
Possibly comical, yeah. Do you have any recollection of what sort of things you wrote about?
Probably about, nature, about my friends, about sports. I was very athletic as a child, so probably wrote some stuff about sport.
What sports did you play as a child?
I was a soccer player, foremost, football, as it's called in the rest of the world.
Oh, and, no, my kids played soccer, so I'm with you there.
Okay, good. And then I also ran track. I was a sprinter all the way up until I was in my 20s. So those were my two main sports. And then I played pretty much everything else at some point or another, and also developed a strong love for basketball along the way as well. Yeah.
So you didn't get into the Canadian ice hockey?
Oh heavens, no. Hockey is not the traditional sport. No, not the traditional sport of the Jamaican immigrants. Although there were some, but I wasn't one of them.
I've been to some of those ice hockey games, and as an Australian sitting there watching, going, like holding my breath, thinking, oh my God, there's got to be broken bones in that collision, and thinking, wow, that is such a violent game.
That's really funny because I feel the same way about Aussie rules football. I still don't get it.
Yeah, well, that's true. And in Aussie rules, of course, they don't wear any paddings. Occasionally you'll see a little bit of a head helmet, but mostly there's no protection whatsoever, and just that shorts and singlet, and off they go and play really tough football. Yeah. So I want to ask about after you finished school and went to university. So let's talk about your time in university. And I'm guessing that's where the foundation of your political activism started, perhaps?
Well, I think that's where it found its maturation. It would have begun in high school while I was still living in Scarborough. I was very involved at the community level. I was involved with a community group here that's called Tropicana Community Services that is for the Caribbean community in Scarborough. And so I was involved with their youth group and became politically aware through that process.
And so what did the youth group... I'm sorry, Greg, to interrupt, but I'm fascinated. What did the youth group do? What did they have programs? Did they assist youth in trouble? What did they do?
Well, our group was mostly a social action kind of group. So we would create events that would bring together young people in our part of the city, and we would talk about and debate different issues. So some of them had to do with the relationship between Black men and Black women. Some of them would have to do with strictly with youth focused events. Some were just general awareness raising about what we were doing as a youth group. Some were very political, focused on the provincial and federal politics in Ontario and in Canada. So there was a mix of things that we did.
Yeah. So obviously that started in high school, and where did it lead to when you went to university?
Well, when I got to university, I was there for 6 years. I was taking my time. And so it pretty much broke down to what I did the first 3 years and then what I did for the remaining 3 years. So those first 3 years, I was a very active anti-racism and anti-discrimination activist on campus. I wrote socially conscious news articles, and I participated in protest rallies, and I was a member of our anti-racism group on campus at Queen's University, which is where I went to school. And so I was doing that stuff. I was the Black guy with the megaphone, very much for those first 3 years. And cool. And when I was in my third year, I decided with a couple of friends to run for student government, and we were elected as a team to be the student government executive, and I ran for president. And in the process, I became the president of the first Black president of the oldest student government in Canada, and. We served a year doing that, and then the rest of my time at Queen's was spent engaged with governance. So with the Senate, with the Board of Trustees, with the Alumni Association, doing what I could to help students during a very difficult time. It was the mid to late 90s, and in Canada, it was a time when the cost of education was escalating at a very rapid rate, and there were issues around accessibility and about increased student debt loads. And so I was an advocate in the governmental realm on those kinds of issues. So that was pretty much how I spent my time at Queen's. Yeah,
very busy by the sounds of it, with wonderful causes. So can I ask, in Canada today, what the university system is like in terms of students ending up with debts at the end of their study? Is it better, worse? Do you know?
Oh, well, I'm still involved with my university in some ways, and so I have some sense. At this point, things have changed quite a bit from when I was in school 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I can't believe it's been 20 years, but anyway, that's another conversation. But the cost so quickly. It really does go quickly. The time goes really quickly. But the cost of post-secondary,
goes way too quickly.
It's so fast, and life is a never-ending story, I suppose. But the costs are quite high, and they've differentiated now. So if you decide you want to do law or medicine, then the debt load you graduate with is much higher than if you do an arts, just a regular arts or science degree. Yeah. And student debt continues to be a major issue in Canadian politics.
Yeah, my son has just graduated from a private university here in Australia, and his debt is $110,000 for his physiotherapy qualification. So that's quite a debt to start with at the start of your working life. It's a shame, isn't it, Greg?
It really is, and what it does is it cripples the ability of young people to come quickly into the economy. Yes. And so if they're paying that money to interest instead of to interesting things, then they are not helping with the with the financial stimulation of the economy. And so I think across the Western world, we have to give ourselves a good hard look in the mirror and say, what are we doing to our own futures if we're going to cripple our future with debt before they even get going?
I agree, and education of our young people is just so important. I passionately believe that education is a key for so many things, and I would think your views would be similar, Greg. Well,
I mean, we don't have much of a future if we don't get schooling correct.
Yes.
And so we've got to make sure we lay the proper foundations, that we make it as accessible to everyone as possible, provide that equity in opportunity, and that we do what we can to make sure that people have a good shot at life. Because if we don't do that, then some of the trends that we see where people have just simply decided not to go to university and try to do it another way, that will continue to grow, and that will shift the nature of the economy, and in good ways in some ways, but also in challenging ways. So we've got to be aware and make good decisions based on that.
Yeah, education should be a fundamental milestone of the human experience, I would think. But not everyone has equitable access to the sort of education that they need to make it in this world.
That's right.
And speaking of education, in 2012 you were given the accolade of Canada's smartest person, which is really cool. Can you tell our listeners about that experience and how that came about?
Oh, goodness. So, yes, I received a call out of the clear blue sky one day saying that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the good old CBC, was putting together a television special called Canada's Smartest Person, and they'd heard about me and could I apply. So I said, sure, fine. So I went online. This application took me a few hours to fill out, but I did it. I went through their process, and in the end, I was selected as one of the 4 national finalists from I think it was a couple thousand people who ended up applying in the end. And so I was one of the 4 finalists, and I ended up being on this 2-hour special that aired on CBC TV nationwide. Yeah. And it was myself, a gentleman named Marshall, who was a science teacher from Winnipeg, a young woman named Laura, who was like a researcher in Vancouver, and then this other gentleman, Peter, who was a football player for the Hamilton Tiger Cats in the Canadian Football League. And so the 4 of us competed. So Peter actually was the one who ended up winning the overall title, but I was a Canada's Smartest Person national finalist. So and billed myself as Canada's Smartest Artist for a while. So that was a lot of fun.
I'll bet, but I can't imagine answering 2 hours of questions on national TV would have been particularly fun.
Oh my goodness. Well, the 2-hour special was a series of challenges. So one of them was like a word art one, and then one was like there were some models and they were in some clothes, and then they went in and they took some things off or moved things around, and you had to remember what they were wearing before and point out the changes. So it was stuff like that, so there were all these different challenges, and I was right in it. I was right in it until the very end. The very last challenge was a cup stacking challenge. So it was whoever
goodness.
It could like take down and then put back up the cups the fastest. And I was right there, and then one of my cups, right at the very end, on my last try, one of the cups flew off the table, and I was out.
No way!
So I didn't. So because of losing that one cup, I did not make it to the final head-to-head challenge between the top 2 finishers. I ended up finishing third.
Damn! And what was the final challenge?
Oh, it was like an obstacle course kind of thing. So you had to like answer a math question at one point, and you had to like walk through this kind of maze thing at another spot, because the premise of the show was that they were testing all of the different intelligences.
Yeah.
Right. So that was the idea, and it was a lot of fun. I'm glad I did it. It was pretty hilarious, but yeah, it
What
just
a
seems like.
idea. Do they still do it, or it was just a one-off?
I thought it was going to be a one-off, and then they had a bunch of seasons after that. So, you know what? Yeah, they did it a few more times.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
Yeah, it was neat.
Excellent. So one of the other things you do was your alter ego called Ritalin.
Yes.
Did I pronounce that correctly?
You did.
Excellent. So can you tell our listeners what that was about?
So Ritalin was my stage name when I was doing spoken word poetry performance on a more full-time basis. So I was involved with the National Poetry Slam community, and I was very heavily involved for many years. And so I traveled across Canada, and in fact, traveled internationally as well, performing and using my spoken word for performance and for advocacy, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about later on. Yeah. But as a slammer, I was definitely a top-ranked competitor in the Canadian scene. And 2012 was a big year. Not only was I on Canada's Smartest Person in 2012, but I also finished second at the Canadian Individual Poetry Slam Championship. Yeah. And then later in the year, won a national team slam championship with my team from Toronto. So I was a 2012 National Poetry Slam champion. And it was an incredible year.
Yeah. So for our listeners, can you describe how a poetry slam works?
Well, what you have is a room full of people interested in listening, and an open sign up. So anybody who wants to participate, they would sign up on a list. There's usually a limit, usually 10 or 12 people. Yeah. Each poet would have the opportunity to get on stage, perform a poem that they wrote themselves, that they would perform without the assistance of any music, costumes, or help, and they would just get up and they would perform the poem. Yeah. Usually a time limit of 3 minutes with a 10-second grace period. And after they performed the poem, they would get a judgment. So there would be 5 people in the crowd giving out scores. Yeah. You know, anywhere from 0.0 to 10, 8.5, 9.6, 7.3, whatever. Yeah. And they drop the highest and the lowest score, add the 3 middle scores together for a score out of 30. And the poet with the high score at the end of the night wins. It's really that simple.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, I think of poetry and rap. Don't ask me why my brain couples the two together, but they're not the same, are they? Although I guess you could think of rap as a form of poetry. What do you think?
Well, music is poetry to a melody, and rap is poetry to a beat. So it's all the same thing. So whether you're rapping, whether you're singing, whether you're flowing in free verse or in rhyme in your quatrains or whatever it is that you're doing, all of it is poetry. And as long as you're performing it vocally in front of a crowd, it's poetic, and it has power, and it has meaning and substance and a life of its own. Yeah. And, and once you share a poem in front of a crowd of people, the universe takes hold of it, and then it will do what it will with that poem. And that's been my experience of being a poet for the last 16 years.
Yeah. Leo wants to know, is this like Drop the Mic?
Drop the Mic. Is that like a television show, or?
I'm not sure, Leo. We might need you to clarify your question a little bit. I was hoping Greg would know what drop the mic means, but as an Australian, I'm not familiar with that terminology. So, Leo, if you're listening, just drop us a line and let us just clarify that question for us a little bit. I agree with you.
I'm not much of a TV. Okay, cool. Because I'm not much of a TV person, but I guess if people are on stage and they're performing poetry, then I guess that would be spoken word. Spoken word is just performance poetry. Yeah.
Excellent. So how long did you perform as Ritalin? Was it a number of years?
Well, yes. I mean, in certain contexts, I still use the name, but I first used the name Ritalin in 2003, which is when I did my first slam performance. 16 years ago. And for me, the name means, because of course Ritalin is the drug that people with attention deficit disorder take in order to help them focus.
Yes.
And so for me, the meaning of the name is, just like the drug, my poetry is intended to help people to clear away all the clutter and the nonsense and the noise that's going on around there and focus on issues that are important. And I speak mostly about powerful personal stories, as well as social justice and social change related issues. That's the focus of my work. Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain power in poetry because you have to concentrate and listen to the words to participate in that whole experience of listening to poetry, don't you? You have to quiet your mind and concentrate.
Yes, you have to allow your mind to be cleared of everything else and to just absorb the words and the movement of the poet on the stage.
Yes.
And to take in, both the vocal and the performative aspects of the piece.
Yeah.
And then just allow yourself to respond, whether that is to laugh or to cry or to rage or to think harder or whatever it is, because like any good art, a powerful spoken word poem is designed to make you feel something.
Yes. And that's what it's about. People need to feel and be engaged for change to happen, don't they, Greg?
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah, you got to get your heart into it as well as your mind.
Yeah. So where has the poetry taken you? So has it led... Go on, sorry.
No. At first it took me onto slam stages, but from the slam stage, I was able to take it into schools. So I've done quite a lot of work with young people in schools all across Canada and at international level. Yeah. But I believe most powerfully, the spoken word has taken me into social advocacy. And for 7 years, I acted as the poet laureate for the International Initiative for Mental Health Leadership, which took me to the United States, took me to Ireland, took me to Australia, right in your backyard, Toni, where I was in Brisbane, and I have also seen the beautiful Gold Coast of Australia up close and personal as a result of that trip, which is wonderful. But it's given me that opportunity, and I published a book. An ebook that was a collection of my poems that I wrote during my time as poet laureate, which is called Lead on a Page. And through that work, I've also been engaged at the domestic level as well, predominantly and most importantly through the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And they have a couple of initiatives. Most noteworthy is the Headstrong initiative, which is now looking to make international connections. So if you're out there and you're looking for a powerful mental health program focused on children and youth, the Headstrong program that I've worked with for the last few years is looking to keep its work going internationally. So that's one of the programs. Yeah.
So Headstrong is predominantly in Canada, but you're looking to go global with its programs.
Well, it's done many programs at the international level already. So we just continue. Yeah, so they're just always looking for people to work with. So that's part of what I do as well, is work with the Mental Health Commission as well. Yeah, it's good stuff.
And with mental health, it's really important that we get people to understand that there should never be stigma around a mental health diagnosis, should there?
No, I mean, every person who's diagnosed with a mental health issue is just a living, breathing human being like anybody else, and we all have our challenges. So let's work together to work our way through it, end the stigma, and make sure that people get the help and support that they need so that they can make their biggest possible contribution to society in general, you know?
It would be wonderful if the world at large would view a mental health diagnosis such as depression, anxiety, etc., as no different from having hypertension or a heart disorder. It's just a disorder of your mind. And there's lots of things you can do, and you can still live a wonderfully fabulous, amazing life with a mental health diagnosis. But a lot of people still see that as the death knell or something that is not great, when it can be a bit of a blessing, I've found.
Mm-hmm. Because well, I mean, ultimately, like mental health issues are basically they're based on your brain chemistry and how your brain
exactly right.
deals with information. That's it. That's all it is. And you know, and sometimes people forget that your brain is also part of your body. So a mental health issue is also a physical health issue.
Yeah.
So let's just approach it that way and just work to make sure people get better. Period.
Yeah. Well, Greg, we're going to pop on for a little break and a song. So, listeners, after we come back, I'm going to talk to Greg about his battle with depression. So, over to you, Rebel, and I'll talk to you all again soon. And hello, welcome back to Radio Toni. I'm your host, Toni Lontis, today, and we're talking with my wonderful friend from Canada, Greg Frankson. And before the break, we started to touch on the subject of mental health. And Greg, I know that you've battled with depression and it debilitated us. And I thought it important this morning that we talk about that impact of depression on your life and how it affected you. So can you tell our listeners how that started and what happened?
Well, I was diagnosed with depression back in May of 2011. Yeah. I was going through a difficult time. A bunch of different things came together in my personal life and my work life, artistically, a bunch of in my relationship, a bunch of crises all came together within about a week to 10-day period. Yeah. And I basically I broke down, and I ended up going to see a doctor and was diagnosed and was put on medication for the first time, and began to try to work my way back from that initial experience.
Yeah. So for those of you listening, depression often strikes at a time in our life when you're facing a whole combination of big things. And would you agree, Greg, that there was just a lot of stuff on your plate at that time?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And, you know, when your ability to cope has already been challenged, and then it just felt like something in my brain just flipped. And it made it all extremely difficult, and then was able to discover that through going to see some medical practitioners that in fact I did have clinical depression, not just blues, not just upset over the things that were happening, but a condition that had been triggered that was already there. That is, a chemical imbalance in my brain that resulted in a certain set of feelings, thoughts, and emotions overtaking me at that time.
Yeah, and it's so important for anyone that is experiencing depression. And when I say depression is that I can't get out of bed, I can't face life. For me, it was crying for no reason for days and days and days, and just not being able to function at a level that I had previously functioned at. And the doctor explaining to me that your brain needs a break. It just can't keep doing things the way that you're doing things at the moment, and it's quite debilitating, and you do need to seek help and help to get through that, don't you, Greg? So you were saying that your doctor put you on medication. My doctor put me on medication too, and it was, I'm not sure about your experience, Greg, but for me, I had fought being on medication for years before I actually gave in and took the tablets, and for the first time in my life experienced life beyond the fog of depression, I would describe it. What was your experience, Greg?
Well, I had a very mixed experience on the first time that I was on the medication. It immediately helped.
Yes.
There's no question that it immediately helped. The world got clearer. I was able to stay focused in what I do. I mean, I also live with ADHD, so that is also an exacerbating condition.
Yeah.
So, I was able to do all of those things. But what I found, which was very difficult for me personally, was that there's always some kind of a side effect that comes along with taking these kinds of medication.
Yeah.
And for me, is that it made it very difficult for me to channel my creativity. So as a person who was a creative professional, that was obviously a pretty significant challenge. So I had to work my way through that, having the medication actually successfully balancing my mood, but at the same time negatively impacting the way that I was living my life and making a living. So there's a big story.
Sorry, Greg, go on.
I'm not saying that's a big story that's involved with that. That's all I was going to say.
I would agree. The medication helps so much, but then it always has side effects, and it's those side effects that often change the path of your life. One of our lovely listeners, Ivy, wants to know, you seem so happy. Are you over the depression? And before I get you to answer that, Greg, I want to point out that you can be depressed and still have a happy persona, and it's often you're a naturally happy person, but the depression works in a way that debilitates you in other areas of your life. So I've been diagnosed with major clinical depression, but I'm generally a happy person, and that's because of the medication. Would that be your experience too, Greg?
Well, I think it's actually a side effect of the way that I was raised, that I have this particular disposition. Yes. And when I say that, I mean that in life, I've grown up Black in North America, as a Black man in North America, and there are certain societal pressures and challenges associated with that ethnic and gendered identity. And
which is tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, it's like I try to describe to other people. It's like my life is constant warfare. Like there's no rest. You're constantly on alert. You're constantly aware of what's going on around you. You're constantly assessing what's happening in terms of the way you're interrelating with others and the way they interrelate with you. And so as one of the defensive mechanisms that I think I've learned ever since childhood, it's just to present as pleasant a face as possible at all times. And that isn't to say that I'm being fake or fraudulent or, it's just to say that I've chosen to show that part of the world, that part of my world to the rest of the world as my primary method of interaction. And I am happy, and I'm very proud of myself, and I'm proud of my family and my background and all that stuff. And so I'm usually in a pretty good mood, And
I would agree with you, Greg. I have a very happy disposition. That's a normal part of my personality. And I too, like, once you've had a breakdown and had the diagnosis of depression, you're always on the lookout for things or situations that will pop you back into that dark, black, depressive place. You're hyper alert. I would describe it as being hyper alert to the things that would trigger your depression. I actually had a second breakdown, and it was only after the second breakdown that led me to change the way I dealt with life and the way that I looked at life, and that's been a huge blessing for me. And if I hadn't suffered the second breakdown and depressive state, I never would have discovered those skills or sought the education or sought the help and therapy that I needed to change my life.
Right.
And I know that for you, Greg, it had the same sort of impact on your life. It kind of changed your life path a little, didn't it?
Well, yes, definitely the first one did. I've had 3 major crises in terms of my depression. I've had 3. So I had that first one. I had another one, I believe it was in 2013, and then I had another one at the end of 2014. Yeah. And all of those incidents, they leave a mark,
They do.
But they also are tremendous teachers.
Definitely.
I feel so much stronger. I have a much better sense of myself. Yes. I have a much better sense of who I am in the world around others. Yes. And I see my depression, some may see it as an affliction. I see it as a gift, and it has forced me to become better. It forces me to be better all the time.
I agree. It definitely is an amazing teacher in developing things like boundaries around the behavior that you will accept from people and the situations you will or won't put yourself in have all been directed by my battle with depression. And it sounds the same way for you, Greg, as well.
Oh, yeah. That part is definitely an ongoing evolution that changes and morphs as it goes along, whether I'm on medication or I've come off of the medication or I'm trying a new medication or whatever that looks like. There are stages and phases that you got to go through. And I think that's the same as life in general. But when you've got that condition, it really forces you to be a lot more accountable to yourself. Yes. And to be in a state of constant self-evaluation.
Constant.
To survive, to move forward, and to be better tomorrow than you were yesterday.
Yeah. What our listeners might not realize is that with a diagnosis of depression and medication that you start, sometimes the medication only works for a certain amount of time, and you then might have to change something. I don't profess to know why that happens. I just know that it does happen. So thankfully, I have been on a different medication for a number of years, and it has been the best for me. But there may come a time down the track where we need to look at a different medication again, and that's part and parcel of dealing with depression. And it's common to have to change medication. And the other statistic to note is that once you've been into a major depressive episode, there are certain statistics like that it's going to happen again. Hence why you're always on alert and why you're always evolving and self-evaluating. When you say that's correct, Greg, it's constant.
Well, yes, absolutely. And I feel lucky that not only have I been going through those things for the last 8 years in particular, although I'm quite sure I had depression before that, but since being diagnosed 8 years ago. But because at the time I was diagnosed, I was also serving as the poet laureate for the International Initiative. Yeah. I had access to an incredible support system and to resources. And I think that is the biggest challenge that's out there, is that oftentimes people are dealing with these situations and they don't have the resources. Now, whether those resources are medical or pharmaceutical, or if they're, counseling, whether that's clinical counseling or spiritual counseling or whatever that is for an individual person, whatever works for them. But people don't know, and people don't have the access, and people don't have the training or the skills to know where or how to look. And even if they do, and they go to try to access those systems, because of the way that global mental health systems are structured, it's exceedingly difficult to get mental health support unless you are in a dire crisis situation.
I would agree.
And that needs to change.
It does definitely need to change. Leo wants to know, what kind of side effects are we looking at? So I'll let you answer that first, Greg. And I know you've already spoken about the impact it had on your creativity. Were there other side effects you want to tell our listeners about?
Well, I mean, my sleep patterns go all over the place. I was fortunate. I didn't have a lot of weight gain, but some people have a lot of it. I just put on a few extra pounds, like 3 or 4 extra pounds. Like, it wasn't a big deal, but that can be a big problem for people. The process of your body adapting to the medication can be quite unpleasant. Yeah, really unpleasant, and weird feelings in your stomach and in your head, and the heavy eyelids and the headaches and the stomach aches and the achy body, and there's all kinds of stuff that can come along with that. And then you can also do what I did the first time I went on meds, is I stopped taking them cold turkey, which I wouldn't recommend.
Don't do that.
Anyone out there. Yeah, don't do that. Don't be a Greg. Don't quit your meds cold turkey. That leads to a whole other set of side effects that are
really, really unpleasant.
Yeah. So there are all kinds of hazards that come along with it, but at the same time, there has to be a recognition that not all effective treatments involve the use of pharmaceuticals. You can be on meds and it'd be amazing for you. Some people don't need it, and it's all very personal. And you have to figure out what your treatment plan is, whether that's going to be cognitive behavioral therapy or just regular talk therapy. Medication, exercise, diet. There's a lot of different aspects to it.
There's a lot of non-medication things that you can do to help with depression. But knowing that sometimes medication is the only answer for some of us, the chemicals in our brains just never get it right, I guess you'd say. And the medications make the chemicals in your brain work like they're supposed to. And I'd agree with Greg. I actually had a lot of weight gain. So for me, I put on 20 kilos.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it had a major effect on me in terms of weight gain. And Sam wants to know, what are the signs we're looking for in depression? So I'll go with you first, Greg. What signs did your depression manifest at? And if you can remember back to your younger years, because I'll add on to that from my own story, but from your younger years, when you first kind of thought maybe depression was there, retrospectively, of course, you don't actually recognize or realize usually that that's what you're going through.
Mm-hmm. For me personally, the number one tell is, how neat is my living space? If my living space is neat, I'm probably okay. If my living space is a disaster and my dishes aren't getting done, that's usually the first hint that something is out of whack.
Wow.
And that's just a personal tell for me. So when I look around my place right now, I see that it is moderately messy. Yeah. And I have been dealing with a couple of things as of late, but things are not out of control by any stretch. Yeah. So you learn to identify certain tells for yourself. Yes. Another tell for me is my sleep pattern. If my sleep starts to get weird, I know something's not right. That's a really big one for me. And if I have a specific witching hour, like I'll just pop awake at 4:00 in the morning, just boom, and I'll be awake, and it's always at 4:00. It's not at 3, it's not at 5, it's at 4.
4 a.m.
Yeah, 4 a.m. When I start having 4 a.m. wake ups, something is off. So there's just different things along the way that do that for me as well, and I'm also noticing that that diet is a big deal. If I start eating garbagey food, I'm going to feel like garbage. If I eat good food, I feel better. Yeah.
I agree. From my perspective, I probably had the first signs of depression in my late teens. I got a nursing background, so I was around lots of doctors, and I remember going to see a doctor in my 20s, and she begged me to start some medication then. Because I was a nurse and because there was so much stigma around a mental health diagnosis, I refused to do anything until I was in my 40s before I actually agreed to take medication. But that was on the crux of a major breakdown. So I left work one day, got home, and could not stop crying for weeks. That's what tipped me to go to a GP who was fantastic and immediately recognised, I think you're clinically depressed. We have to do this, this and this. I want you to stop working. And my story went on. And it took a long time to accept and get used to. That was my diagnosis, and it was okay. I'm okay. The world's okay. And I live with depression now, and it has brought more blessings than pain. Apart from the weight gain, which I actually ended up having weight loss surgery in 2018 to manage, and have been much better for it. So, Sam, in answer to your question, depression is not just tears, but if you cry and cannot stop crying, and other things like Greg said, and I would, now that Greg said about the messy environment, I can actually pinpoint that too, like the washing not getting done, and you usually have the washing done, or the ironing not getting done, and you usually have it done. So Harper says, are you saying you are able to notice your tells and get help? And I'll let Greg answer that first.
Well, to be completely honest,
it's a good question, isn't it?
That is definitely a yes and no answer.
Yeah.
I guess it depends on where you're at,
Yes.
Sometimes you'll see the tells, and then a week later you'll be in bed and you're not getting out of bed. And that's just kind of what's happening. Other times you'll be like, oh, hell no, this is not happening this time. Yeah. And you'll take different actions. I think it just kind of depends where you're at.
It does, definitely. And it's so much geared to what is happening in your life. And sometimes we don't have a lot of control about things that happen. So, an unexpected death in the family is it can be a trigger. For me, it's not so much the big things in life. It's a whole collection of little things like the gas running out, combined with any of my animals sick, combined with one of the children, my adult children having a rough time, combined with my husband having a bit of an issue at work. That'll be all those little things will be enough to tip me. I don't know if it's the same for you, Greg.
Yeah, it can kind of be that approach of like just things dribble into this big pit, and then all of a sudden you realize that your balance is no longer in balance.
Yeah.
That one is weighed down by all this stuff, and you're way down here. And how do you get back up?
Yeah.
It can sneak up on you.
Yeah.
You can think everything's great, and then you realize a couple weeks later that everything is decidedly not great.
Not great.
And and how do you recover from that? So it's a little bit up and down for me personally. I think everybody's experience of depression is a little bit different too. I know that with some of the people that I know, their depression manifests quite differently, presents very differently than the way that my depression presents. But we're all equally depressed,
Yeah.
But it's just it's different impacts of the way that your brain decides to process the issue.
Yeah, yeah. Before we go to the next break, Ivy's rather wants to know, what if you don't know what to look for? Well, I'm guessing that if you're tipping into depression, then your first port of call is going to be a doctor, and they will be able to help you with knowing what to look for. And Sam wants to know, does anyone ever self-diagnose to the extreme? You want to answer that one, Greg?
Yes, self-diagnose, self-medicate. Oh my gosh. Yes, I think we as a society have become very good at figuring that we know better than everybody else.
Or so we go to Dr. Google.
Yeah, exactly. And Dr. Google, he's a jerk, man. He'll freak you right out because he'll tell you the absolute worst case scenario of everything, and you are going to be convinced that your right arm is about to fall off or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, don't do that. Talk to an actual GP. Talk to an actual medical doctor. And in terms of what to look for with depression, I don't think there's any one specific thing because, as I say, it presents so differently for everybody. But I think the main thing is that if you feel like your world is not structured and flowing the way that it should be, but you feel like you're doing all the stuff you usually did, and for some reason it's not working, that might be an indication that something else that you haven't considered is going on. It could be depression, it could be something else, but whatever it is, take a look, because it's sort of like reverse Einstein insanity, right? Like trying to do the same thing over and over to get a different result. But if you're doing the same thing over and over again, and then you are getting a different result, and you're not trying to, then you might want to look into that.
Ivy says, with so many things out there, how do you know that you have something or not? And my answer to that would be, I think you need to have a good medical doctor. We call them general practitioners in Australia. You need to have a good doctor to go to, and it often helps if you've got friends that you trust who can say, hey, I'm not sure life's good for you at the moment. Are you okay?
Yes, checking in with people is totally okay.
Yeah.
If you get a sense that something seems a bit off of somebody in your life, it's better to ask than to not ask. Yeah, it's better. I would rather risk offending somebody than risk missing something.
I agree, because depression can kill. But I don't think people realize that depression is disastrous if left untreated, and it has the potential to kill you if you allow it to get to the point of no return. That's where suicide is based in, that thinking that there is just no way out. And there is, Greg. There's always a way out of anything. You just need to be able to ask for help.
Absolutely. It's like I always say, you always have a choice. Even when it seems like there's no choices, Your choices might not always be great, but you always have a choice.
Yeah. There's always something that we can do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, take action. Take action for yourself, for your friends, for your family, for your loved ones, for your community. Take action.
Yeah. I'm going to keep talking to you, Greg, we'll skip the next break and we'll keep talking for a little bit, because I think this subject is such an important one, and I really want to make sure that people are understanding and getting and seeking help if they need to. So James is saying too many times people take the wrong choice, and that's right. And I think too, James, that people take the wrong choice because they don't think that they have choices. And Greg and I are both saying very loudly and vocally that there is always choice, which leads me into the next thing I wanted to talk to Greg about, was his advocacy for mental health and what you do in that space now.
Well, yes, in that space now, what I've been doing is I'm actually pulling together some more of my mental health poems and looking to get some of them published. As part of my 4th poetry collection that I'd like to have published soon, as well as with some literary journals that focus on mental health issues. So I'm pulling some of that stuff together. I have one poem in particular that I perform fairly frequently, which to me is sort of like a very powerful encapsulation of what mental health looks like. And it does have a powerful impact. So when I do public events and I talk about mental health and I perform that piece and I have conversations with people so that they can just get a sense of it and hear sort of what the emotional impact feels like once they hear the poem and so using the poetry as a device for social change is so very central to who I am as an artist and to who I am as a person.
Do you want to do the poem on radio today, Greg?
I would love to perform it for you, yeah. Okay,
well, before you do that, I just want to answer Harper's question. How far is too far? Can anyone be brought back to a better state of mind? While Greg gets ready for his wonderful poem, how far is too far? Well, if you die via suicide, that's depression gone too far. And can anyone be brought back to a better state of mind? Most people can, wouldn't you say, Greg? Most people can be brought back to a better state of mind with either a combination of medication, like with or without medication, changing lifestyle, incorporating exercise. There's lots of things like meditation and mindfulness, having really good supportive friends around you. All of those things will help bring you back to a better state of mind, Harper.
Yes,
so there
absolutely.
Are options, and it's very sad if it goes too far and causes someone's death. That's not what anyone would want or seek. So, Greg, I'd love to hear your poem. So, listeners, we're in for a wonderful treat from Greg, and here he is.
All right. This poem is called The Broken, and it goes like this. The beautifully brave are like brittle birch bark bent by blows, born with breath bated, barely able to maintain emotional communion with the vibrations innate to their souls. And when pressure exerted on their reed of society bends it to the breaking point and no other option remains, they snap. Like the click of a camera shutter locks in the scream of a child defiled by napalm in the jungles of Vietnam into the trauma center of memory, they snap. Like defeated legacies of arms, extremities buckle under stress as force of impact shatters the weak who lack backbone, they snap. Like the tenuous connections of neural endings pressed beyond the limits of comfort as the mind is assaulted by relentless relentless past torments, they snap. Like the crackling pop of leather strap against prepubescent skin, crispy as the words chewing out raw hide, they snap. Because they have no choice. Because cohesiveness and wholeness are sad replacements for holding it all together when falling apart is a better way to cast this compound fracture. The broken need a break from breaking. So they snap, just so they can finally be still.
Wow. That is just awesome. That is fantastic. Listeners, that was a rare treat to hear Greg's wonderful poetry and such power from that segment. Wow, Greg, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that with me. That is very powerful, and I see that while you use poetry, it's a powerful medium for expressing how depression is. Definitely.
Yes.
So I know that all of this has led you to change your... Ivy says, thank you for reading that to us. So yeah, Ivy, I thought it was fantastic. Sorry, Greg. All of this has caused you to change your life direction, and you now have a company called Share Your Voice. Can you tell our listeners about what you do with your company?
Okay, well, yeah, sharing the voice is sort of the slogan. The company name itself is Voice Share.
Yes.
And so what do I do with Voice Share is I am, obviously I'm a presentation professional, so I do give speeches and do poetry performance and act as MC and work with organizations at events.
Yeah.
But I also am working directly. I'm, taking in coaching clients from around the world, helping them to work through how they communicate and how to find and to better express their own voice so that they can have a greater impact, whether it's in community, whether it's with their family, whether it's with their work or their employment or their passions, to help to identify how they can work from their place of where they've found their purpose and the passion that lights up that purpose, and how they can pursue that purpose with passion in a way that remains empathetic to those around them. So the guiding principles of empathy, passion, and purpose guide what I do with Voice Share, with people in that coaching situation, and also through the online course materials that I am in the process of creating. So I'm going to be having some courses that will be available to everybody who's listening to the program, and those should become available in the next few months. So I'm very excited about that as well.
I'm going to put up the website, Voice Share Incorporated, in the next break, but I just wanted to tell you, Greg, that Ivy thought that the poem was lovely, and James said, thanks, man, I really needed to hear that. It was brilliant. I wish everyone...
You guys are very welcome.
Yeah. So you're heavily working in your company at the moment, and you have these amazing programs that people can tap into. What do you see as your future direction for the company? Do you want it to go global?
Absolutely. My intention is to continue to do this work, to write about this book, about this work extensively, create articles and books, and to speak, at the national and international level about how important it is for someone to find their own voice by identifying their purpose, working from a place of passion, and following their goals with empathetic purpose, and just putting that all together for people so they can see what's out there. And then another one, it's very interesting that earlier we talked about the whole post-secondary thing as well, because another train of what I've now started to develop is an interest in talking to people about being financially fit and making sure that is all put together, because I find that it's difficult for people to pursue their passion if they don't have their house in order. So that's a big part of it. As I put my own house in order, I also want to teach people the principles that I'm applying to do that as well. So there's all of this stuff coming up. And yes, I do want to do this at the international level, and I'm very excited about the prospect.
Yeah. Because you've actually, despite what we've talked about today, you've actually got amazing skills in labour market analysis, corporate training, sales management, policy development, etc. So you've got business chops, I guess. It's a good way of describing that as well.
Absolutely, yes. And I'm definitely looking to do this in corporate as well as individual and community environments. Yeah.
You've got extensive interest in education in those areas. So I'm thinking that your company will be a wonderful success. Greg, before we have to throw to my final break, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on Radio Toni today. I know you're very busy and I value your time spending with us today. I'm really appreciative of you opening up and talking so honestly, sharing your poetry with my listeners, and being so open about everything. Before we go, though, Mason has one question. How do you function so well with having the depression?
And I thank you, Mason, for saying that I function well. Because to be completely honest, I don't always feel like I'm functioning well, even when I'm functioning. Yes. It's kind of like, I guess the best analogy for it is that you've got your mouth on the bottom of this big jug that's pouring water in at a reasonable rate into your mouth.
Yes.
But the water, it keeps coming. And sometimes the water goes completely dry and you're at a loss. And then other times the water's coming so fast and you can't drink it fast enough, and then it spills out the top and soaks you. So there's always these different things that are going on. But the whole time you're just sitting there looking really pretty, just sucking on the straw. And then anybody else who comes by looks like, oh, yeah, he's just there working, sucking on the straw. That's what he's doing. Yeah. But, it's still an up and down process. So thank you. Thank you for the question. But, yeah, I don't always feel like I'm on top of the game. But, I would agree.
There's days when you just don't feel like you're coping very well. But often we do that in secret. I know I do it in secret when I'm having a bad day and not many people know, but I have my go-to people and my go-to things that I do. And so to the outside world, it looks like we cope remarkably well, but we're probably paddling for dear life outside of that. Oh, Zara. Zara wants to know, what are your thoughts on Robin Williams? He was an amazing man who made everyone happy.
Well, I think with Robin Williams, who, to my mind, is one of the most brilliant artistic minds of my lifetime.
Yes.
I would say that Robin, he did about as much as he could reasonably do, given the state of his brain.
Yeah.
And that's where it comes in, the super individualized experience of mental illness.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think people don't always fully grasp is that the mental illness is the root of the brilliance.
Yes. Yes.
And so for someone like Robin Williams, you can't, and that's why I always had that trouble when I was on my medications, because you can't cure the mental illness in its entirety without removing something essential from the creativity.
Yeah. Yeah, they're inherently linked, and a lot of creatives have depression, and a lot of the side effects of depressive medication is it takes away your creativity or dulls it. So I don't know personally what happened with Robin Williams, but it may be that he was off medication, in which case the mental illness runs rampant unchecked, doesn't it, Greg?
Yeah, it really can. And you know, and I'm in a point in my life right now where I am not taking medications currently.
Yeah.
And it's a different way of managing.
Yes.
Without the medication. So I have to do different things than I would do than when I'm medicated. And you know, and I'm not always successful. So but you do the best you can, and you take it day by day, and you know, you just have to honor where you are in any particular moment, in any situation. You got to honor where you are, and not be upset or frustrated with yourself. You just have to accept where you're at and deal with it accordingly.
So Mason wants to know, what would be the worst of the two, being on medication or losing who you are? What a great question, Mason.
Wow. Well,
yeah,
that's an extraordinarily difficult question. But I mean, I think at the root of the question is, who are you?
Yeah.
And I think that, especially for somebody like myself who is a creative being and makes a living as a creative person, you always have to maintain who you are. And so that's my internal struggle when I go back and forth about, do I go back on medication? Because right now I am in a particularly fruitful season of creativity. And, you know, and taking the medication is going to mess with my brain chemistry in one way or the other. And, you know, the last medication I found was very helpful for me and also allowed me to keep most of my spark. So that was really good. But again, like, do you want to just be who you are and just take the chance that the madness might run a little free every once in a while? It's a difficult balance if this is what you do. It is
incredibly difficult, Mason. For me, the medication that is working for me at the moment is actually not affecting my creativity. I'm actually in one of the most creative spaces of my entire life. But I don't know if the medication will keep working the way it's working at the moment, which is very good. But for me, my side effects are the weight gain, the loss of libido, the needing to sleep 8 to 10 hours a night. So those are that's what my particular juggling act is. And Sam wants to know, how massive are the changes in a person on and off meds? You go, Greg.
Well, again, they're very, I think the most effective medications they take away the crazy highs and lows, and they turn the wild, crazy wavelength into a much gentler wavelength. There's still ups and downs, but the highs are not very high and the lows are not very low.
They even you out.
Yes. If they're working properly, they should simply even you out. So there shouldn't be massive changes. Unfortunately, those are the chemical interactions in the brain. Unfortunately, your brain is connected to this other thing called the rest of your body. And, and so the cascading effects that can happen throughout the rest of the body don't necessarily correspond to the way that the meds are happening well in your brain. In the same way that you might take a cancer medication to deal with a tumor that's in your abdomen, but it can have devastating effects to the rest of your body. It's the same sort of thing. So it's really personal and very individual.
It is.
But ultimately, if it's working optimally, it should just even out the person's mood and shouldn't really cause that much of a difference otherwise.
Yeah. So, Sam, in answer to your question, if I'm off medication, I actually can't get out of bed and I cry all the time for no reason at my worst point. So that makes me a very not the best person to be around. So for me, that is a huge change. Whereas when I'm on medication, I still have down times, but they're not at that really deep, dark, suicidal low. And the crying, I only cry when it's appropriate that I cry. So it's very individual. And again, you need a really good doc and you need a really good therapist, and they're the best things that will help you, combined with the other things like exercise and food, two of the most important things with depression. Olivia's just commented and said, you both said similar things. Is there a time of year that creativity is heightened? Another interesting question. What do you think, Greg?
No, I'm wired all the time. I'm pretty much juiced 24/7. I think, for me and my creativity in terms of when and how I write, I write in seasons, you know, but when I say seasons, I don't mean fall, autumn. I mean, I could write for 2.5 years and be very, very prolific and then slide into an 18-month period where I write almost nothing at all.
Yes.
So it's very up and down, but right now I'm just sort of ramping up into a very high creative period. I hope it lasts a really long time, but I'm just getting back into being super fired up about writing. It is currently coinciding with being off my meds for about 6 months. So I can say that those medications are now completely out of my system. Right. But I do have those moments where, I'll listen to somebody, play a song that has a bit of a sad message and I'll get all teary-eyed and weepy and stuff. It's ridiculous, so there's still the balancing.
It's very much balancing. And, again, the times that I've been off medication, it's just seen a return to the bad black old days, I like to call them. And so that's kind of, you think that you can go off medication and that you will be cured, I guess the word. But it took me a long time to learn that there is no cure. And for me, medication is the thing that works in combination with a whole raft of other things. And as I've experimented over the years going off medication, I now know I'm not even going to bother because I just know. But there are other people, I have lots of other friends, and like Greg, who periodically take a rest from medication. They do it under the supervision of their doctors and their therapists, and it works really well for them. But for me, it doesn't work, and I know that. So again, it's really individual. It's about getting to know yourself really well, and it's about having wonderful, thoughtful, caring people around you who will listen and know when something's not quite right. And I'm assuming, Greg, that you've got lovely, supportive people around you as well.
I'm very fortunate. My family has finally kind of come around to it and have an understanding. And I've got a few friends, locally who have a strong understanding of where I'm at and people I can call and depend on. But I mean, ultimately, I think the main person, and it's just the thrust of the questions, is the main person you've got to be really good with is yourself, right? You've got to have that. You got to have that little Wakandan villager in your head who's just going to stand up and yell, "Who are you?" And you've got to be able to have that answer. You got to know who you are, and that helps tremendously. Yeah.
At the end, we're down to 5 minutes already, so at the end, we'll just keep talking until we run out. At the end, I'm going to put Greg's company website in the chat box, because here is one source of where you can get help by going onto Greg's website and looking at his programs. That's one very valuable and valid space to go for help if you're thinking that you need help. The other thing is that sometimes it's not always family that will be supportive and give you the help and encouragement you need. Lots of times it's a core group of friends, and I'm not talking about a huge village of friends. I'm talking about a few core people that love and care about you enough to say, hey buddy, what's going on with you? Are you okay? And sometimes that's all we need for us to stop and say, oh yeah, I'm a bit unbalanced at the moment. And it is about a balance, isn't it, Greg?
Yeah. Absolutely. 100% about balance.
And people that know and love you will pick up on when you're unbalanced, even if you don't. And I know that for me, my husband is my unbalanced picker-upper, and he's the one that'll say, hey, honey, what's going on with you? I think you need some more sleep, or words to those effect. Because as I've said before, sleep is one of my key things, although I'm like Greg, and every now and then I'll go through a period of time where I wake up at, my time is 2 a.m. So I'll wake up at 2 a.m. bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and I now know instead of lying in bed tossing and turning and thinking, oh my God, I need sleep, oh my God, I need sleep, oh my God, I need sleep, I actually get up and I'll go and write. Or sometimes I'll listen to an audio book or watch a TV show that I've been wanting to watch. But it's very individual. And again, as Greg said, you need to get to know who you are. You need to get to know what works for you and do that. No matter what anyone says, no matter what anyone's thoughts on the matter are, you need to do what works for you, and to hell with the rest of the planet, so to speak.
Indeed, because some other people may think what you're doing is super, super strange and weird and odd. But it doesn't matter. Are you feeling better when you do it? Yes. Does it help you? Yes. Is it therapeutic for you? Yes. And everybody else can go sit on it. It's not about them.
Yeah. So just to share with our listeners, one little thing I do when I'm incredibly stressed is I walk down my back steps, I find my little fluffy goat called Jasper, and I sit with him for 5 minutes. And he snuggles his head into me, I cuddle him, and that works for me. So whatever it is, do it if it works for you. So my wonderful listeners and my fabulous guest this week, Greg, we're down to the 1 minute sign off, and I have to go and get off air. So thank you, everyone. It's been a wonderful show. Greg, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure and a wonderful conversation, and I know that I'll talk to you again at some stage. So over to you, Rebel. Stay on, and I will pop up Greg's website in a moment, but over to you, Rebel. Bye, everyone. See you next week.